Really excited to be able to have USDA involved with our field day here this year and be able to gather a really good grasp in terms of what's happening on a policy side of things from the federal standpoint and what's happening in DC. There's been a lot of movement in terms of carbon. This administration has really put a big focus on carbon. Had a conversation with Secretary Vilsack a couple months ago through the podcast Fieldwork. So, it's a good understanding of kind of his angle on it. And Secretary Vilsack is from right down the road here where I'm at in Southeast Iowa. So a great connection there with Secretary. So excited though to continue on the conversation here, to be able to showcase, the work being done to our farmers, but also to a lot of other industry folks as well. And folks, that are looking at carbon, they're looking at ecosystem service markets. And so I'm excited to spend a little bit of time here with you. So Mr. Bill Hohenstein is here with me, and I have you down as you are the Energy Director and Environmental Policy, or Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at USDA.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So it's Bill Hohenstein. Yeah.
Hohenstein. My apologies.
That's okay. That's a common.
So tell us more about what is this role? How does this work? And what does your kind of day-to-day look like, I suppose, now as you guys are getting rolling? Hopefully things are rolling along in your day-to-day there in DC.
Yeah, so thanks, Mitchell. It's a pleasure to be with the crew virtually. Again, I'm the director of a small office in the Office of the Chief Economist, the Office of Energy and Environmental Policy. And it's sort of as the name implies, we deal with environmental issues, especially around climate change, environmental markets, water quality, and then energy policy. And for ag, that's a pretty broad area as well. Everything from implementation of the renewable fuel standard to how agriculture plays in state renewable fuel markets like the California low carbon fuel standard, to opportunities for farms to generate on-farm energy. Everything from solar and wind to on-farm biomass, things like anaerobic digesters. And then we work with rural development on their programs under Title IX to look at things like how do we improve energy efficiency on farms and what are the opportunities for farmers there. So pretty broad portfolio, and we are busy. As you mentioned, this is a priority for Secretary Vilsack, especially focusing on climate change. And he's very focused on generating opportunities for farmers. So that's where a lot of our efforts are.
So is that a lot of those programs are being rolled out in terms of grants, or what kind of programs would those, watching this video, what would they be seeing these programs as?
Sure. Well, the first thing is to see how this influences the core programs that we're implementing. So those are the Title II programs on the conservation side. You can already see there was an announcement around the Conservation Reserve Program. There's also opportunities to, incorporate these priorities into some of the Title IX programs where there's opportunities to work with farmers on things like renewable energy projects. So that's sort of the first thing. The broader policy that the Secretary talks about, and that I'm sure you're gonna want to get into, that's a work in progress. We've done a couple of things in this, first 5 months of the new administration, even 4. We issued a request for information. So we went out to the public with a whole series of questions around, what should we do? How should we do it? What are the priorities? How are things that are being tried working? What recommendations do you have? We got a really strong response. We have, 2,700 individual comments back, including, over 1,000 individuals that wrote letters in, saying this is what's important to us. And so we're working through all of that, taking that on board as we move forward. So that's where we are. We also
hopefully my response is on top of the list.
Okay.
I'm one of those 1,000. So if anyone wants to check on mine, I posted mine publicly on my social media and stuff too. So if anyone wants to check that out, but then how's that work. So you're getting tons of feedback, but then is that going in as edits to existing bills that are pending right now, like the Growing Climate Solutions Act and Carbon Bank, or is this going to come as potential new bills to be ran through Congress? Or how's that
Sure.
work?
So you can think about maybe three different options. One is USDA already has a lot of authorities. And so there's authorities under the Farm Bill. There's sort of organic authorities that are sort of with the department. So there are things that the secretary can do now with his current authorities, and we're looking at those options. And then you mentioned Congress. Certainly, Congress has got an important role to play. They play an oversight role in terms of what the department does, but they also, legislate. And so there are bills that are floating around on the Hill. You mentioned the Growing Climate Solutions Act, and then there are other ideas that could be kicked around either in the context of the next Farm Bill or separately from that. Our role in the on the Fed side is we are often asked by Congress to provide technical assistance, and so there is a give and take with the committees that are working on these bills. They'll come to us and say, "This is what we're interested in doing. How does this work? Does this language work the way it's supposed to?" That sort of thing. And so we do get involved in the legislative process, but in a consultative way. But Congress certainly leads that.
And that's definitely, I think a good spot to start, in that I think there's a lot of developments that need to be made as we develop policy. Because from my standpoint, it's like, to be able to really create policy that can be nationwide, like there is a lot of gray area here to how do you define a carbon credit, and how does a farmer create it, and how do we model this out, and how do we quantify carbon appropriately? And Continuum Ag has been directly involved in a lot of these initiatives and pilot projects and stuff. And I was one of two farmers on the working group with Climate Action Reserve, and working with the guys at Nori, or tied in with Comet Farm, and folks like Indigo and some of these others that are existing. And then there's a lot of other new projects that are coming as well, that are really interesting. But I think we need to have a better understanding of what is our actual annual carbon footprint of the systems that we are looking to implement. And that's been my biggest thing on this, is that I hope that these policies, or these programs as they're rolled out, are not just a cost share for practice change, but they're helping us to actually be innovative as farmers and quantify our true carbon footprint. And then we can bring that to the market, and be able to gain some value, hopefully, from those efforts.
Yeah.
But being able to
Well,
drive
Mitchell,
innovation.
there's a lot in what you're saying to
Yeah.
unpack. A lot of different pieces. I think you're right. When I talk to growers or companies that are involved, one of the places I start is to understand your greenhouse gas footprint. And so we have tools that we can provide to farmers that help them quantify, what are their emissions of greenhouse gases, because it's not just about carbon. There are a couple of other important greenhouse gases that are, agriculture is a source for, and those are nitrous oxide and methane. So it's understanding, the roles that, farming activities have on emissions of greenhouse gases and carbon storage. Getting your baseline, getting sort of this current snapshot of what the profile of your farm is. And we can help farmers with that. And so a lot of it's going to depend not just on what you're growing. So whether you're a corn farmer, corn, soy, or raising cattle or dairy, it's how you're producing what you're producing. So it's what is the manure management system? What's your nutrient management system? Are you using some form of conservation or no-till? Do you have a cover crop? Do you have some of your land in buffers? All of those things affect your greenhouse gas footprint, and we can quantify that. So we can quantify on an annual basis how much carbon your farm is currently storing, whether there are carbon losses, and what are the emissions of these other trace gases.
Are there some of those things, like what do those tools look like? A Comet Farm, the Comet tool is one of them, but are there other ones that farmers should be looking at as well?
Sure. So Comet Farm is probably the most sophisticated. That's the sort of, the 400 level grad course version of this. It takes a lot of inputs. It's very detailed. You go in, you define your farm, you define your historic practices and current practices. What we found is that, well, that's useful to some farmers. They don't need all of that, right? And so there's a simpler version called Comet Planner, where we've done a lot of the heavy lifting for the farmers. We've run Comet Farm thousands of times, created these parameters, It's a simpler tool. It requires less inputs. And so a lot of farms and states are using Comet Planner just because it doesn't take as much data and input. And then there are other systems out there. There are companies that are creating their own. You mentioned Nori. That's another one. And then there are groups like that are out there as well. That are
Well, in different like the ESMC and some of these, that you're getting at in. But one of the big things that we need to look into on Comet Farm is that in Comet Farm, my understanding of how it is working today and how we've plugged in our farm into it, and I played around with it a good bit, is that you can't plant green in Comet Farm. So if I plant my soybeans on April 25th, that means that I would have had to have terminated my cover crop on April 24th. They can't overlap.
Yeah.
Well, my beans got planted on April 25th, but we just terminated the cover crop last week. And there's some of that cover crop I won't terminate at all. We're going to harvest it in July as a relay crop. How do we help as farmers to plug in some of these really innovative things that we're doing, like planting green and relay cropping and interseeding and diverse cover crops? And there's so many nuances.
Right.
What does a path forward look like to better train the models?
Yeah, no, you're raising a great point. And, that's going to be part of this process going forward, getting, we're calling beta testing, getting it really tried out in the field, in field conditions with real growers. A lot of that has to be done. And so there's a lot of work ahead of us to get these tools, which were, first designed by researchers, as research tools. We've applied them now to be decision support tools for farmers, to help farmers make decisions, to take that to the next step where you can actually use it in a program setting at scale across all these farms with all these different options out there. It's a little bit of a heavy lift, but it's certainly one that's in our plan to basically kind of take this set of tools to the next level.
And have a tool.
You get that response, not just from you. I've got a friend that raises cattle, does rotational grazing, and he's frustrated with Comet Farm because what he sees in there is not what his operation looks like.
Correct.
Right?
So
we definitely have some work to do there.
Part of that, and with, and that's where I wanted to kind of go with this conversation, not only for us to be thinking about and hopefully, continue to drive some of that. And obviously I've expressed a lot of my thoughts here to Secretary Vilsack as well. And working with folks locally, here in Iowa too, has made a good push on this. But what's your response, and how do we think about farmers that have already been doing some of these practices? Because in Comet Farm or in the models today, it's based on the practices that you were doing versus the change in practices. And my argument is that carbon sequestration in agriculture is not a one-time change, like putting a scrubbing system on your facility or planting an acre of trees. That's a one-time kind of thing, and then it sequesters carbon for the next 100 years or whatever. But in ag, it's not like that. So how do we better understand what's our true carbon footprint of each individual farm?
So one piece is, what we talked about, which was the technical side. I think what you're also raising is how do you treat the early adopters, the innovators, the ones that have been doing these practices? And you're right that if you just simply take a tool like Comet Farm, it's not going to show any change because you're already doing these practices, right? And that's sort of the way these voluntary offset markets have been treating the early adopters and the innovators. And what they want to see is a change from what you're currently doing. We've, in the report that we just put out, which was our initial recommendations on how we're moving forward, we recognize that it's a challenge, and we're going to have to address that directly. And there are options. It may not be that those folks that are the early adopters end up in a private market, but we've also got to figure out a way where they're not put at a competitive disadvantage because they were in fact the innovators. And so that's reflected generally in these recommendations, that we know that's an issue. We know we're going to have to deal with it, and that has to be part of the solution that's going to work for all farmers. How we go about it is still something we're working through, right? Is it, those farmers would actually, fit more into a sort of traditional conservation program type approach, or do you figure out an accommodation or how they'd be dealt with in these emerging private markets? There's a lot of work to do there. We're not going to do this alone. We're going to want input. especially from those affected, from the farmers that are out there. And the thing that I try to remind folks is these are the folks that you want to encourage, because those are the folks that are on the cutting edge of new technology. They're the ones that are influencing their neighbors and other farmers that are out there.
Well, and I definitely, like I said, I think they're the ones that are going to be able to influence, and they're the ones that have been there, done that. They're the important people to bring everyone else along with them. And I mean, we're in that boat. We started no-tilling in 1978 and using cover crops in 2013. And the data coming off my farm, I've shown that I've been able to improve organic matter by 1.4% in the last 10 years. And so we've gone from, like, on one of our farms, we went from 3.9% organic matter to 5.3% organic matter on average, which is just incredible compared to the literature. And if you convert that in the tools that I have, you can convert that to almost 5 tons of carbon sequestration in the upper profile. Now, how do I stratify that down to a meter deep? I don't really know, but
Right.
5 ton, nearly 5 tons, like 4.6 or 4.8 or something like that. But my point, and because I hear a lot of farmers, or hear feedback on, well, farmers should get paid for the carbon they've already sequestered. And I'm like, no, that's in the past. Like, there's other programs and we've already been reaping the benefits of improving soil health and building organic matter. That's different. But that story and the real carbon that we're sequestering on an annual basis, even if I'm like 2.5 or 3 tons or something like that, which is where I think I'm at, down to a meter deep. I want to be able to help these companies to meet their goals. And today we don't qualify because we've already been doing the practices, but I don't want to get paid for what I've already done. That's in the past. But I think if we can better define those innovative things to help us to quantify what are we actually doing on a day-to-day basis, then that's where we can really level the playing field. And because I just worry that if you weren't checking the box and now you're checking the box, you get paid. Well, that cover crop box, that's a big thing. There's a lot of nuances too. Cover crop or no-till or so.
Yep. And that's where working with a crop consultant or your NRCS field staff, that's going to be really critical. One of your points in your example that folks don't fully appreciate, which is really critical. And we get challenged quite a bit about the quality of the numbers that come out of agriculture when it comes to, do we really know that carbon is being stored? And part of my response is, it's stored because it's there, right? So your example is, you may not know over a year how much carbon is being sequestered.
For sure.
Right? Because there's a lot of variability in agricultural systems. But over 10 or 15 or 20 years, if you're saying you're storing, say, 1/3 of a ton per acre per year, after 30 years, you're going to see the difference. It's going to be there. It's undeniable. And that's what your example is showing, is that it's actually very easy to verify and quantify these numbers over time.
Well, but I did it with the tools available to me today, which was loss on ignition organic matter. We are doing some of the dry combustion stable carbon testing as well. But from the labs, that's just not a very scalable thing. What I'm really interested in helping with and what I want to bring people along the journey on is, how do I reverse engineer that stable carbon that we are only able to really quantify every 5 or 10 or 20 years? Because it takes a long time. But I think there's some leading indicators that we can use from an agronomy perspective and from an on-farm perspective to say, here's the leading indicators to that 5 or 10 or 20 year benchmark. But here's how we can really show that we're making some solid progress to at least help the buyers to feel good about it too, I think.
Right. Another point we try to make is that you don't necessarily need to do this on every farm. If one of the things that's being kicked around is, do we need a national soil health monitoring network? Do we need to actually do this more systematically? And if we had the data systematically across different, practice types, across different commodities, measured, periodically over time, we'd probably be getting less questions about the quality of the data. And we'd have a better understanding of the effects of different practices on carbon sequestration rates, and overall confidence would, increase. And the side benefit of that is that it wouldn't be the burden of the individual farmer who's trying to enter into these voluntary markets to have all the costs associated with this, farm scale measurement. When we look at why offsets aren't working well for agriculture. And I think it's pretty undeniable that there's not working up to their full potential. And we've done a study where only 2% of all the offsets that are traded, voluntary offsets that are traded in the US, are coming from agriculture. So that's 98% that are something else other than ag, right? Part of the reason is that it actually, in an individual ag project is really small relative to, say, a landfill or an industrial project or even a big forestry project.
Sure.
And all the costs associated with the record keeping, the measurement, the quantification, the recording, registration, verification is being borne by these really tiny projects, and it's not working. So what we're thinking about is how you bundle these projects together, simplify some of the things we can simplify, and using the fact that if we do this on not just how large is your farm,
Yeah, well, we're farming 700 acres, so yeah, I mean,
you do it on 700 acres, that's a lot of cost to bear for one farm, right? But if you do it on, say, 100 farms, those reporting and verification costs become a little bit more manageable.
No, I totally agree. And one of the things we've been doing for the last couple of years is we've been doing weekly soil sampling on some of our trials, especially cover crop versus no cover crop. And that's primarily with the Haney soil health test. That's the main thing that we use in helping farmers to manage fertility and manage for soil health and stuff. Now it's a stable carbon testing that's just kind of come about over the last couple of years, at least from our, agronomy management, crop consulting side of things. But and I'm really trying to learn, like I said, those leading indicators. And I think I've got the data to be able to do that, at least for my own farm and some of my customers' farms in Southeast Iowa. But for what you're talking, on being able to pull existing data sets, is that one of the things that, dollars from Growing Climate Solutions Act or others can go after? And do you think that data is out there to help us to kind of jumpstart, plugging some more numbers into Comet Farm and other tools?
Yeah, some of the data is out there, but some of it isn't. So, and what I would say is where some of the big holes are. For one, simply our data on the extent of different conservation practices is lacking, right? And so when we ask NRCS, what's the extent of conservation tillage or no-till? Oftentimes the data we're getting is 5 or 6 years old, sometimes older than that. So, part of the push is to actually get real-time data on conservation trends. And that's really critical to being able to tell the story that agriculture is improving. These, we're seeing increases in cover crops. We're seeing increases in variable rate technology. We're seeing increases in the use of anaerobic digesters. I mean, these things are happening, but our data isn't always picking that up because our data sometimes, 3 to 5 to sometimes older. So part of it is getting good, consistent conservation surveys done so we know the trends. And then the second part is, this soil health monitoring, or getting sort of the baseline of what the current conditions are, especially when it comes to soil carbon, because we're going to need to come back to those numbers over time, again, because as farmers adopt these practices, they're going to be storing carbon. We're going to be able to see it on the landscape.
Yeah, that's kind of been our approach and stuff too. We did this spring, we did a bunch of that stable carbon testing all over the country on some pilot projects, and that we can go back to in the coming years, go back to those same GPS spots and be able to track over time. So really interested in, not only what the government side of things is going to be able to do to help us to populate these data sets, but also from the private sector, maybe we can help as well to plug in. But what do you think? So with the farmers that are listening to this first, what do you suggest for them here today on how to approach these markets? What should they be?
So markets are just one opportunity, right? So, I think what you were suggesting is, understand where you are, sort of, what's your current greenhouse gas profile? What are the practices that are driving greenhouse gas emissions on your farm? And then coming up with a strategy for how you're going to manage that, where there are opportunities and how big they are. Is it changing tillage practices? Is it, putting in a cover crop? Is it, a nutrient management plan that might include things like enhanced efficiency fertilizers? Are there, is there a section of your farm that might be better off in conservation? And quantifying that, right? So understand your numbers and what the potential is on your farm. Get a handle on that. and then think through your various options. One might be to work with NRCS through a program like EQIP or CSP or an RCPP, where you'd be partnering with the government, and farmers are doing that. Another might be these voluntary offset markets. And there, I tell farmers to read the fine print, understand what they're committing to, what their obligations are, what it means if they decide they don't want to do this, if they want to get out, what are their obligations, what are their responsibilities. Because oftentimes these folks are, farmers are being contacted by a developer. They've got their own interest in what the project is, so just know who you're dealing with, what their stake is, and go in with an informed, kind of view on sort of both how these systems work and what indeed you're signing up for.
Yeah.
There's a third set of which is emerging, which I think is actually pretty interesting. And that is, it's kind of like offsets, but it's more focused on the supply chain. And so what we're seeing is there are a lot of consumers out there that want to buy climate friendly, carbon friendly, right? And so we're seeing increasingly companies that are sourcing soybean or corn, beef, that want to be able to demonstrate that their feedstocks and their sources are climate friendly. And that is another market opportunity. It's different than offsets. You don't necessarily require the same level of reporting and verification, but you do require some level of traceability. Can you actually trace the product from where it's grown to where it's being used? Yeah. One of the exciting things we're seeing is that that's actually happening in the biofuel space. Mm-hmm. And so folks that are growing corn or soybeans, where they're feeding their crop into either the ethanol or the renewable diesel or biodiesel market, there's going to be the potential for those fuel manufacturers to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of what they're producing, and they can do it by partnering with farmers. And so there's some pretty exciting things sort of on the horizon where, it might be offsets or it might be contracts with, purchasers where, these benefits that, for the practices like the ones you're implementing are going to be recognized.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're spot on. That's a lot of the same message that I've been giving to farmers too. And on the ethanol and stuff side of things, I think it's going to be really cool when we have a ethanol blended fuel that inherently is carbon neutral already, because the corn that's going into it is a carbon sink, offsetting the carbon footprint of that fossil fuel that it's being blended with. So that's going to be awesome. But to play devil's advocate on some of this, farmers are looking at, okay, where's my baseline today? And there's a lot of hype, of course, around cover crops, and this whole system is coming together. The stars are definitely aligning. You can't open up an ag magazine without hearing about soil health and carbon and cover crops and all this. So there's a lot of farmers that are saying, okay, I'm ready to take the jump. I'm ready to make a change. But if they do that now, they disqualify themselves from some of these carbon markets. But if they jump on a carbon market today and the fine print isn't quite all worked out, then they could be hurting themselves in the long term. And some of these carbon markets, if you do the carbon market, you can't participate in government cost share programs.
Yeah.
So it's how do we balance some of that? Because I'm seeing a lot of farmers just saying, well, I guess I'm just going to sit and not do anything. And then we don't solve any of the problems. Yeah. That's the issue.
Right. Again, I think, having sort of getting this recognized. So we're definitely going to be continuing to work with farmers and growers, getting their thoughts and their opinions, again, on, where there are barriers, where there are problems. I think raising those issues actually helps. It helps, in terms of, folks on the Hill that are going to be working on sort of what future systems might look like. It certainly is going to be helpful to us as USDA works through, how we, develop these opportunities with our existing authorities and our existing programs. Because the Secretary, obviously is he's indicated we're going to be moving forward, and we're going to be using our existing authorities, and we're going to try to facilitate these emerging private markets and markets for carbon-friendly commodities, and working through our programs. And so getting the sort of having a good understanding from growers, the issues they're facing, the challenges they're facing, and the reasons why they may not be taking action now, that's always helpful.
do you think, what do you foresee the role of USDA being in the short term beyond just, okay, collecting some of the data, providing some of the technical support, but how soon do you think that the carbon bank would be funded, or would USDA be part of verification and utilizing satellite imagery or other means to help to verify some of the claims? Or do you see any of those other pieces coming through on the USDA side, or where do you think the role is going to be, at least initially?
Yeah, we're certainly developing some options for that. I mean, clearly, we already have a role in research and quantification. That work could be better organized, and so we're thinking through. Again, you kind of talked a little bit at the beginning about innovation, right? We want to make sure that whatever we set up, we're not a barrier to new ways of doing things, new practices. And so, on the research side, it's going to be creating the protocols for how you do this research, encouraging innovation in the private sector, and creating a pathway for how you get those practices implemented in the field. So that's one thing USDA is certainly going to be focused on. Improving the numbers. I mean, you sort of said, are you just going to be improving the numbers? That's a big deal. A lot of work is going to go into that, right? Both at a national scale and at a farm scale, trying to actually get simpler calculations that we're confident in, that folks can stand behind. So we're not sort of in this system where there's lots of numbers flying around of all sorts, right? And then thinking through both, what our role is in terms of integrating this into our programs like EQIP and CSP and CRP, how we can work with the private markets to streamline that process and address some of the barriers they're facing. And that could, there's a broad array of things we could be doing there. And then how we work with folks that are going to be purchasing commodities that want these carbon-friendly attributes, and how do we facilitate that? And we've got a program, the RCPP program, where we can partner with the private sector. And so we have some existing authorities. We have a program called the Conservation Innovation Grants Program that's been really effective in terms of piloting and testing these ideas. So we're not going to be sitting still, I would expect.
No, definitely not. And that's what, all the messages coming out of DC are, hey, carbon is a big thing. We're going to get it figured out. We're definitely going to do something. But I'm seeing a lot of companies and a lot of private industry money ready to kind of go into some of these. But I think kind of sitting back on the fringe, what are you telling the dollars that are watching this? And what are you telling the companies that are looking at trying to evaluate what their role is going to be? How did they kind of get started here, and how can they help to move these initiatives forward at large?
Yeah. So we're, pretty much giving everyone the same message. Basically in terms of what we're doing, we're certainly interested in partnering with the private sector, and then also in our assessment of how the private markets are working. We've looked at the reasons why it's not working better for agriculture and what the barriers are, and so we're definitely interested in the private sector kind of moving forward as well to address some of these barriers. The fact that there's uncertainty in terms of what the numbers are on these protocols, that the scale of individual projects is pretty small, and that farmers are bearing a lot of the cost with kind of generating, these credits for really tiny projects. Dealing with confusion, dealing with really pretty high verification costs that might be simplified if you actually think about things at a different scale.
Well, and I think something that's going to be interesting with it is, as we are sequestering carbon, we're improving all these other things. And you started talking about that earlier, like we can reduce our nitrous oxide emissions, we can reduce methane, but I think it's also going to be really interesting to see other environmental outcomes like improving water quality, improving against flood mitigation, improving our impact on our aquifers and in water quantity and quantity credits. So how are we approaching some of those? How should farmers be looking at it, or should USDA be looking at that? What about some of these other ecosystem service market opportunities?
Yeah, so some of these, might be public goods, right? That would sort of align with a federal type incentive, and that would include things like, there are going to be strategies that also improve habitat. So certainly you mentioned water quality. Many of these practices that improve soil health, that improve nutrient management, also have water quality benefits. a lot of these practices like rotational grazing, like buffers, have wildlife benefits. So there might be an array of these benefits, some of which there are private markets for, some of which are more public goods. And so, there's a concept called stacking. Can you actually figure out, who values these, how to integrate these values into what the farmer receives, and how to stack them so the true benefit to society is actually recognized by the farmer.
Yeah. And I think I like your comment there on who values this. And I think that's part of the like confusion on this overall. And why I kind of worry about the carbon side of things is that it's still kind of arbitrary. It's you can't hold a ton of carbon in your hand. But we can see we have direct dollars right now associated to flooding. And we saw that there 2 years ago now over on the Missouri River, and all those billions of dollars in in damages due to flooding, or in terms of water quality in the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, or Lake Erie, or right there in the bay there around DC. Like there's real dollars in negative impact, or in insurance claims and stuff like that, that I think we could work together as farmers to say, hey, we can do this cheaper than what it's costing in the current system today. But how do we better understand that, and how do we quantify the dollars that the issue represents today and obviously there's a lot of different outcomes here, but are there methodologies on which we can quantify the problem?
There are some, and some of them are trickier than others. The federal government just updated what they call the social cost of carbon. So just looking, again at carbon, trying to figure out for a ton of carbon, how does that ripple through and create costs across the economy, across time? It's not easy to do. It always gets questioned. So I've been through several rounds of updates to these, social costs of carbon. But you can take that approach and apply it to other environmental outcomes, water quality, habitat, wetland, and some of it is trying to value the losses that are avoided. Some of it is trying to value how society, how the public, treats these things. And there are ways of actually gauging that. None of them are perfect. All of them are, open to questions and criticism. But it does allow you to be more systematic in terms of how you weigh the costs and benefits of different approaches.
Sure. So, and I'm sure we're gonna need to let you go here soon, but obviously I could keep asking questions and talking for a long
That's
time.
okay.
But a couple more things is, okay, so with back to just energy and stuff overall, obviously big push going towards electric vehicles and stuff like that. Well, electric vehicles are, most of that energy is produced from coal and from fossil fuels. And a lot of that, we're seeing a decrease now in the use of ethanol in some of those markets. And I mean, I don't think you can even get a flex fuel vehicle here today, that can run E85 and stuff like my old truck was running E85, and it was super, inexpensive for me to run that, and it worked great. And now I've got a new truck, and you can't even get flex fuel vehicles anymore. But my argument would be, well, in a flex fuel, in an ethanol space, we can directly offset the carbon footprint of that fossil fuel. We can use a heck of a lot less than doing it all based off of electricity. And obviously, there's a big push for windmills and solar and other stuff, but for the most part, it's still coal. Where do you see that? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, no, and I think our what we've been counseling is let these fuels compete. What we've seen is that within conventional systems for producing biofuels, whether it be ethanol or biodiesel or now renewable diesel, the greenhouse gas footprint of those fuels has gone down pretty much every year as production efficiencies improve, as productivity in the crop improves, as we're switching out how the energy sources that are used in these plants. All of that's actually created a more greenhouse gas friendly fuel. And what we're looking at now are opportunities to go beyond that. Again, like connecting with farmers on climate smart farming practices, thinking about co-locating, say, an ethanol plant with a feedlot where the ethanol, the DDGs get fed to the cattle produce methane that drives the ethanol plant. Those sorts of systems are really greenhouse gas friendly. And, so we think that there's a lot of opportunities for biofuels to compete effectively with any sort of transportation greenhouse gas mitigation strategy. And so, you just sort of let the cards fall where they may on that. That said, there's a lot of infrastructure in place that's driven by liquid fuels. And most of the cars coming off the line are still internal combustion engine vehicles. I think about 2% of cars put on the market last year were either EVs or plug-in hybrids. And so a really small chunk. So even with very rapid growth in those markets, 10, 15 years from now, there's still going to be a tremendous number of internal combustion engine vehicles that are on the road. Most of those vehicles, virtually everything that was produced after 2000, can use 15% ethanol. So there's the potential right away to kind of expand blend rates beyond what historically has been the blend wall. And there's still going to be a role for high blend vehicles and the potential there. And so we're actually continuing to work with retailers to install additional capacity to sell our higher blends of fuel, and working with the manufacturers to ensure that the demand for those vehicles is being met.
With demand overall, I know it gets a little bit out of your sector, but what do you think farmers should be looking at here now in terms of demand for our grains overall, especially especially here in the Midwest? Obviously, corn and soybean prices are just going nuts. But a lot of uncertainty from China, a lot of uncertainty from other parts of the world.
Yeah, no, I think if we've learned anything over the last several years, how connected these markets are, how important stable trade environment is, the effects of the pandemic. There have been a number of significant shocks to the sector.
Yeah.
That said, currently things are strong, but having domestic markets that are stable can be really valuable to the sector in terms of providing stability to farmers and farming.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see, as it seems like there is a lot of instability that hopefully things will keep kind of shaking out a little bit. But obviously we're using a lot of our grains right here too. And maybe we can be independent to be able to secure things as much as possible. And I always stress to farmers, trying to just be able to take, management over as many of the factors that are going to impact your bottom line as possible in terms of cost of production and being able to market smart.
Control your own destiny.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, well, this has been great. I need to let you go, and you can keep things rolling. But kind of final stuff is, what's your final message, final takeaway for farmers or for companies and folks watching this, and maybe start there. Then I got one more.
Sure. Certainly pay attention to what's happening, and definitely we're interested in your input. So, even though the comment period has ended, we're certainly interested in continuing to engage with producer groups, with farmers on their views as we continue to roll out the strategies that the Secretary is outlining. So that's one. I think, and then I think, pay attention to what's happening in the private market space as well, especially for those that are thinking about, creating offsets or getting into the offset markets. Just, making sure you understand how these work, what you're committing to, and really what the value of what you're producing is.
Yeah. What about last one is, what's top of your to-do list now, whether that be for the rest of the day or for the month of June, and how do we help? How do we continue to help you and the initiatives overall?
Right. So we rolled out this report that had 7 recommendations. Each one is pretty high level. And so we're developing plans for each of those recommendations to implement each of those recommendations. So that's really, front and center in terms of our work. We're internally, we call this our readiness strategy. How are we going to be ready to kind of roll out these recommendations and, really meet what the Secretary is laying out in terms of his vision on how things are going to work.
Well, we'll definitely check that out. I'll try to find that and get that like kind of linked in and stuff here too, so everyone can see that. But really appreciate you spending the time here today. Like I said, bummed that that we don't have you in Iowa with us. But maybe next time we'll
Maybe
get you.
next time.
Maybe
Hey,
next
Mitchell,
time.
really appreciate you reaching out. Great discussion. Really appreciate the questions.
Well, and appreciate the work you guys are doing, and just knowing, that the farmers are ready for this. If anything is very clear, it's that the momentum is here, and there's real opportunities to be had, and real opportunities for family farms. So that's what we got to keep pushing for. So
Okay. Well, thanks.
anyway, I appreciate it, Bill. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Take care.
Have a good day.